I want to take just a little while to kind of talk about the Middle East, really with a focus on Iraq. And so I just kind of like to walk you through some of that there. But let me start by saying when you look at the administration's Middle Eastern policy or strategy or plan or desire or wish or whatever the hell it is, at best it's ill-conceived, and it's really tragically obtuse. It really is. And whatever we have as that policy is totally misaligned with our allies in the Middle East. So here we are. Let me give you 7 quick points. Number 1, Iran's currently influences a Shiite arc, and that arc goes from across the Levant. It stretches from Iraq's eastern border with Iran all the way through Syria, through Lebanon. Iran's controlled Iraq's Shiite government ever since we left in 2011. In fact, they controlled it pretty much before that, but it's total control since 2011. Iran's had a major influence over Syria since really since 1983, when Assad's father and the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, formed an alliance. And there's been a lot of things happen with that alliance since then. So Iran has also maintained significant control over Lebanon. And they've done that through the creation of Hezbollah, which Assad's father and the Ayatollah created again in 1983. Hezbollah has over 30,000 militants in it. And in Lebanon, it is essentially a state within a state. Now, Iran will do whatever is necessary, whatever they have to do, to maintain their control over the Shia arc that spreads from their border on Iraq all the way through Syria and into Lebanon. Currently, ISIS is a major threat to Iran's influence, and that's important to remember. Now, number 2, Turkey's problem is that it's got to maintain manage the jihadists, it's got to manage the Turkish separatists, and it has to manage Syrians' Iranian leadership, which they want to get rid of. Turkey's ultimate goal, though, is for the region to once again be under Turkish influence. If you watch what Erdogan say, you can see this coming out a lot. Consequently, they need to replace Assad with a Turkish-friendly Sunni government. Turkey's not now threatened by ISIS, but they will be. Number 3, the Arab states are trying to steer our efforts against ISIS. They're trying to steer those efforts over to the toppling of the Assad regime in Syria. The Sunni Arab states want to undermine Iranian control in both Iraq and in Syria. So consequently, for the Arab states now, this is a sectarian struggle for them. Now, when you lay all that out and look at it, both the Arab states and Turkey are Sunni, and they both struggle against Iranian influence in the region. They both want to get rid of Iranian influence in the region. The Arab states, though, strongly oppose the idea that the region again should fall under Turkish influence. What they do, they remember the Ottoman Empire. Now, number 4, ISIS is a future threat to the security of the Arab states and also to the security of Turkey. But the important thing to remember is that in the short term, ISIS serves both their political and their sectarian interests. Currently, ISIS is fighting Assad in Syria and both the Iranian Quds force and the Shia militants in Iraq. And this falls in line with the objectives of both the Arab states and the Turks. In addition, ISIS is fighting the Syrian and Turkish Kurds, which is the YPD and the PKK, which, as you all know, that benefits Turkey. Turkey like nothing less than to see, nothing more than to see the capabilities of the Turkish forces diminished. Number 6, so you look at our policy. Our policy is to enlist the Sunni Arab states and the Turks to join in the defeat and decimation of the ISIS force. But now, we just outlined and talked about, for the most part, the actions of ISIS are in line with the political and sectarian desires of both the Arab states and the Turks. Consequently, at this time, any military assistance that we're going to get from the Middle East is going to be largely symbolic, and I think you can see that. They've done a few airstrikes, and that's about it. So number 7, this leaves us with only the Shia militants and the Iranians that align with our policy of defeating and decimating the ISIS forces. So unfortunately, what we have is they're both enemies, and therefore our strategy is an alliance with the devil. So let me start with Iran and kind of move west. 80 million people, second largest country, second only to Egypt, all Shia. We got a new prime minister there, Rouhani. So you say, is he a new face and a new relationship, or is he a new face in the same old relationship? I think he's the same old relationship. The sanctions, though, that we've had on have pushed them to negotiate, and so now we've got them to the negotiating table. But if you look at that, you can see if the Israelis and the Arab world are totally against us having a nuclear deal with Iran because they don't think we can cut a good one, and I don't think we can either. Iran's going to have to decide, though, how much they can afford to sacrifice in the nuclear negotiations in order to ease the economic pain they're feeling right now, because as the price of oil drops, and it continues to eat away at the revenue stream of the Iranians. And really, the oil for the Iranians is about 35% of their GDP. So the talks between Iran and the P5+1, which is the Security Council, the UN Security Council plus Germany, they've gotten stuck on the number of centrifuges that will allow them to keep, number one, and number two, on the amount of research and development will allow them to do in their nuclear program. And those two issues are hard issues for Rouhani to sell back home. Now, the Iranian public supports the negotiation. They're for the negotiations. However, though, they're resistant to the two elements I just talked about. 70% of them say, okay, you cannot cut back the number of centrifuges we have. 75% say you cannot keep us from doing any amount of R&D that we want to do in the nuclear area. So what could happen is Rouhani could walk away from this saying that it violates national security, and I wouldn't be surprised if he does that. Rouhani believes that he can survive if he walks away because, number one, a deal without public support is likely to fail, and number two, the sanctions can't be ramped back up again. And that's important. You know, we took a lot of the sanctions off the table when we started all this, and now the leaders of Europe and Asia are not going to ramp them back up again because they're making too much money dealing with the Iranians and they want to do more business. So much of the problem here is the credibility of the president, of our president. So many of the nations in the world doubt that President Obama has the willingness to use force, even if it's to prevent the Iranians from having a nuclear weapon on his watch. So Iran's development of nuclear weapons, as all of you know in here, will lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, lead to proliferation. John Abizaid and I had lunch with the Egyptian General Staff 2 years ago, just about a week before the Arab Spring started. And I asked the chief of the General Staff, I said, what are you going to do if the Iranians develop a nuclear weapon capability? He said, you asked the wrong question. I said, well, what's the right question? He said, the right question is, what the hell are you going to do if they... I said, I don't know. He said, well, you better figure that out because we'll take it in our own hands, which means proliferation. Also, they would offer an umbrella, a nuclear umbrella to terrorist groups. It would vastly diminish the influence of the international community. And then you never can forget that they got a long-range missile capability that they could weaponize. And their missiles today currently range all the way to Scandinavia. And within another decade, they'll be able to reach the United States. So Iran, as you all know, they continue to support regional terrorism. They support Hamas in Israel. They support Hezbollah in Lebanon. They support the Hezbollah fighters that are fighting for Assad in Syria. And they support the Shiite militants that are in Iraq. And, of course, they're supporting terrorism, Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan. They got sleeper cells everywhere. So the bottom line here is, succeed or fail, the handling of Iran will most likely define history's judgment of the Obama foreign policy, if there is a foreign policy. It'll also shape the future of the entire Middle East. I believe that the way we handle Iran and what comes out, what unfolds in the next 2 or 3 years will shape the Middle East for decades. So if you want to understand Iran, you need to look at a Persian rug. It looks good, it's complicated, it's intricate, but it's made with a lot of patience. And one thing they have is patience. Let's go to Iraq. 32 million people, 60% are Shiite, 20% are Sunni, 20% are Kurd, which isn't a religion, but the Kurds are mostly Sunni, but they're also Shia, and they're also some Jewish, and there's also a lot of Christians in Kurdistan. It's an oil-rich country with developed oil fields in the south and huge undeveloped oil fields in the north. In fact, in the north is probably the sixth largest oil footprint in the world. Their newly sworn cabinet contains really just a bunch of political holdovers from Maliki's reign. The new PM, al-Abadi, is cut from the same cloth as Maliki. Consequently, the new government is doomed to be as dysfunctional as was the old government. And so the inclusive Iraqi government that our administration has wrapped his arms around is a myth. There is no inclusive Iraqi government. The new government looks suspiciously like the old government, yet we're tasking it to solve the same set of problems that were caused by the old government. So we're asking them to do it with the same set of players. The new Minister of Oil, Al-Mahdi, has been in the government there since 2004. The new foreign minister is al-Jafri, and al-Jafri was the prime minister before Maliki. All of the post-war prime ministers have important posts in the al-Abadi government. Like I said, Jafri as the foreign minister, Alawi is one of the vice presidents, and Maliki is one of the vice presidents. So you can see the hand of the Iranians in there, and the Iranians are all on top of this. The Iraqi Prime Minister, al-Abadi, spent last week in Tehran meeting with Rouhani to discuss Iran and Iraq's next steps toward what they're going to do about ISIS. So in the past 2 weeks, he's also filled two of the most important cabinet positions, the Minister of Defense and the Minister of the Interior. But first, before he did that, he went to Tehran and gained the approval for his two choices. He sure as hell didn't come to Washington and ask for approval. He went to Tehran and got approval. He chose al-Abadi as a Sunni for the defense minister, and now his job is going to be to try to separate the Sunnis in Anbar from ISIS. Lots of luck. That is probably going to happen for a while. And then he appointed al-Gaban as a Shiite. He's a Shiite. He appointed him as the Minister of Interior. And al-Gaban is extremely close to Iran. He was a member of the Badr organization, which is close to Iran, and he's been in and out of Iran for years. So at this point, many believe that the only chance they have in Iraq now is a confederation of Shia, Sunni, and Kurds, and that's probably the only possible option. I don't think that's going to happen. However, the Sunnis are showing no interest at all in doing this, and the Kurdish participation is contingent upon, one, hey, pay me the money you owe me, government. They owe them $13 billion from 2013, 2012. They want resolution on their concessions of oil, export, and revenue sharing. And that's important to them because by next month, the Kurds will be pumping 300,000 barrels a day by next month. Third thing they want is resolution of disputed territories. The disputed territories is that band of territories just south of what we now call Kurdistan. It's where Kirkuk is, Mosul, and places like that. That should have been, in their constitution, that was supposed to be solved in 2006 and 2007, but the State Department stopped it, so it's never been solved. And then they want funding and arming of the Peshmerga. You know, the Peshmerga is part of the security forces. They were supposed to receive part of the arms and ammunition and things that we sent over to the Maliki government. The Kurds, the Peshmerga, have not received one bullet from Baghdad, not one bullet. And then they want to increase control over Kurdish airspace. So as we all know, ISIS has now created a swath of land, 600 miles. It goes from the Syrian border all the way to the Iranian border. And you got to think about that. It's 600 miles, 620 miles actually. That's an emirate that Osama bin Laden could only have dreamed of. To understand our options in Iraq, I think you need to go back and you got to look, like, how did we get there? What caused us to be where we are? Let me run through it real quick. In 2003, when we went in, we should have formed a federalism. We should have put them under federalism and had federal entities, a Sunni federal entity, Shia. Kurds were already in a federal entity. And this would have made them comfortable from an ethnic, religious, and tribal standpoint. Instead, we tried to make it a democracy just like the United States. In 2003, we disbanded the Iraqi army, which ensured that we would never have enough security forces to do the things we needed to do. In 2004 and 2005, we turned our backs on the Kurds. who had been our allies, helping us in the north. We turned our backs on them and established the one Iraq policy, saying you can't deal with Kurds, you can't talk to Kurds, anything you do has to go through Baghdad, through the Maliki government. 2008, we turned our back on the Sunnis that had helped us clean the Taliban out of Anbar. We turned our backs on them like we'd done the Kurds in 2004. 2010, we strongly backed Maliki with full knowledge that he would disenfranchise the Kurds and he would persecute the Sunnis. 2011, we failed to negotiate a status of forces agreement, which ensured we wouldn't be able to consolidate the gains we had made, and also ensured that we would not be able to complete the training of the Iraqi army. And then you see what happened because we couldn't complete the training of the Iraqi army. 2013, we draw a line in the sand in Syria over the use of chemical weapons. Then we cowardly back away from it, and then we sent a message in to all our enemies that we're all bark and absolutely no bite. And then 2014, we again strongly backed Maliki. Now, we were back in Maliki last June. I mean, by that time, we knew he was a puppet of Iran, and we knew that he would continue to persecute both the Sunnis and the Kurds. And then in 2013, 2014, we failed to acknowledge the black flags in ISIS that were flying over Mosul and most of Anbar province. I was in Kurdistan in last November, and then I came back about mid-January of 2014. And in November, you could see the black flags of ISIS flying in Mosul, and you had to pay a tax to ISIS to get into Mosul, and it was rapidly spreading at that time eastward all the way over to the Iranian border. So where are we now? Well, the Iraq we created became an ally and a political instrument of Iran, not the United States. And if we put it back together again, it's again going to be the instrument of Iran and not the United States. The ISIS threat in Iraq, now remember, the ISIS threat in Iraq is a much, much greater problem for Iran than it is for us. And Iran has only two Arab friends. They got Assad, Syria, and al-Abadi's Iraq. Now, the ISIS leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a well-educated, he's media savvy, and he's fashioned an effective, well-trained, well-equipped army. And it's interesting, he changed the first part of his name to Abu Bakr, and many of you might know the reason for this. Everyone in the Middle East knows the reason for this. That the original Abu Bakr was Muhammad's father-in-law. And he was the first Muslim caliph. And he was the one that established the Sunni opposition to the Shia. Now, everyone in the Middle East realizes the significance of that name, Abu Bakr, which he has adopted. What we need to do with ISIS is we need to follow the money. The ISIS thugs, these guys are the best bank robbers in the world. I mean, they're great. And they got to be, because ISIS is a very expensive organization. They have to pay their members, they have to buy equipment, they got to buy ammo, they got to maintain the services and all the provinces that they occupy and now control. I just read in a couple of different reports, they pay in their soldiers $1,000 a month. That's a lot of money over there, a lot of money. The most important thing for U.S. policymakers, though, to remember is that ISIS has and possesses the financial means to support a long-term war, a very long-term war. They have well over $2 billion in reserves. However, their preferred fundraising methods have a lot of vulnerabilities. Now, their income stream comes from oil that's smuggled, extortion, taxation, and a variety of criminal activities. But oil is the largest source of their revenue, and oil also has the greatest amount of vulnerabilities because ISIS controls about a dozen oil fields in both Syria and Iraq. They also have fixed and mobile refineries. And their estimated production capacity is about 150,000 barrels of oil per day, 150,000 barrels per day. So the oil is smuggled out in trucks. So the key here is that oil fields, refineries, tanker trucks, and the routes that they use are all clearly visible by the air. Now, we ought to take out the oil fields, take out the refineries, take out the trucks, crater the roads. Another vulnerability is that their money is moved to the leadership by couriers. So if you find the couriers and you follow the couriers, you find both the money and the leaders, and it's a pretty good prize. What we ought to do now, we should dump Arab Iraq and support Kurdish Iraq. Kurdish Iraq is really the other Iraq. It's what we wanted Arab Iraq to become. It's democratic, freely elected, extremely pro-U.S., more pro-U.S. than the U.S. is pro-U.S. It's oil rich. You think about that. I mean, they're sitting on the sixth largest, and the Kuwaiti oil minister told me in 2003. He said, "Look at Kurdish Iraq, because in 20 years they'll be right where we are right now." They're high on minority rights. All the Christians have fled north. All the people that have been terrorized down in Arab Iraq have fled north. Their constitution says, the Kurdish constitution says that the parliament has to have a minimum of 25% women. They've got over 30 Christian churches. They got 5 bishops. They're strategically located. I don't think you could find a better place in the Middle East to be located. So you think about it. If you look to their east, it's our enemy, Iran. You look to the south, it's our enemy, Arab Iraq. You look to the west, it's our enemy, Syria. But to the north, if you work it right, we got a NATO ally, which gives you great, great lines of communication. As an area of operations, I think it's a military man's dream. Let's walk over to Syria. Syria is it's a country in rebellion, and it's not in a civil war. Syria's in a regional war, Saudi versus Iran. It's not a large country, 21 million people. 75% are Sunni, and 12% are Alawite, which is an offshoot of the Shia religion. So you got 12% ruling the rest. Syria's got a 58-year history with Russia. They signed a treaty with Russia in 1956, and so Russia provides them with military equipment support, and in turn, Russia gains access to warm naval ports. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad, who's Bashir Assad's father, who's an Alawite, and like I said, offshoot of Shia Muslim, he became the leader of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, and he gained control of the Syrian government. In 1983, Syria and then the new Islamic Republic, and you remember the Shah has been overthrown, Ayatollah Khomeini's taken over. So Assad and the Ayatollah form a strategic alliance, and they create Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah is a militia that controls now today much of Lebanon. It's fighting also in Syria. They're fighting for Assad. In 2000, Hafez Assad dies, and he's replaced by his son, Bashir Assad. And we're elated when we got naive expectations like we have in Iran today. We think that because he did his doctoral studies in the United Kingdom, and he knows how to use a computer, that he'll move to westernize and democratize Syria. It turns out he's actually more rigid, more doctrinaire, and really more cruel than his father ever was. So in 2011, you get what we call the Syrian Civil War, which is now really a regional war. Now we have over 180,000 Syrian civilians have been killed. 7 million have been displaced. Remember, I just said they had a country of 21 million people, so 1/3 of the population has been displaced. Over 2 million refugees have left Syria and gone to Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Kurdistan. Kurdistan's interesting because Kurdistan only has a population of at most 5 million people, and they got 1.5 million refugees up there right now. Of Assad's many problems, one of the largest is the economy. The pre-war revenues from oil, taxes, industry, tourism, and agriculture, most of those have all dried up. And then we knew at the time that he had foreign reserves of $18 billion before the war, and those have now depleted. So Assad can only now pay his soldiers, his militia, and his civil servants, and he does that through funds that he receives from Iran. So Iran is keeping him alive from a funding standpoint. I think that the failure of the U.S. to carry out our threat to punish the regime for its use of chemical weapons is kept Assad in power. I think he'd have fallen by that, but that's kept him in power. And not only that, more importantly, it's weakened the United States in the Middle East and in the rest of the world. If you don't believe that, just look at how we've been treated by Russia, North Korea, China, etc., since we drew that silent line in the sand and erased it. Finally, I'd predict that Damascus will collapse at some point. It just can't continue to roll, so it's going to implode. And the aftermath of that, I think, will be catastrophic compared to what we see in Syria today, and that's pretty serious. Lebanon. Yeah, Lebanon's a little country caught in the middle, 4 million people. 95% of them are Arab. Of that, 60% are Muslim, 40% are Christian. In 41, Lebanon got its independence, got it from France. In 43, they developed a national pact. The national pact said, okay, we're going to have a president, and that guy's going to be a Maronite Christian. And we're going to have a prime minister, and he's going to be a Sunni. And then we'll have a National Assembly speaker, and that guy's going to be Shia. So in 1982, the invasion by Israel, after the invasion by Israel, Hezbollah is created. And again, it's created by Assad in Syria and by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they create it and they move it into Lebanon. And Lebanon now has become the home of Hezbollah. And it's often described as a state within a state. And it has total operational freedom in Lebanon due to its political power and the military force that it has. The military force is significant. They got over 30,000 militants. They got a massive arsenal with advanced weapons. They got over 55,000 rockets and missiles. And most of the weapons are stored in civilian areas, in hospitals, schools, mosques, in total violation of international law. So after the war, if the war does end, I think you can see Hezbollah will return to Lebanon, and you can see three things there. Number one, they'll be a lot stronger, and they'll take more control of Lebanon, if not all the control. Number two, they will be ready to deploy outside of Lebanon. You know, they'd never done that before until the Syrian war. And number three, they will wreak havoc on Israel. So let's turn to Israel. Our most loyal ally, population almost 6 million people, 75% Jew, 25% Gentile. The biblical Jewish homeland. There's been perpetual Jewish presence in the land of Israel since the time of Joshua, 1400 BC. 3,500 years, consecutive years of Jewish presence. You think about that. Jews are less than 0.5% of the world's population, yet they've created or they've produced about 20% of the Nobel laureates. That's pretty good. Less than 0.5% produced about 20% of the Nobel laureates. Totally democratic state surrounded by enemies. Continue under missile, rocket, mortar threat from the two terror organizations in the north and south, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south. In 2013, there were over 2,500 missile and rocket attacks against Israel, either by Hamas or Hezbollah. That cuts down to about 210 per month, or about 7 per day, about equal to the number of airstrikes we have per day against ISIS. So remember that Israel geographically is a very small country. As all of you know, you can drive, in some places it's less than 10 miles wide. You can drive from north to south in less than a day. This year, we've had already over 4,000 rockets fired into Israel. And currently, Israel's endorsed the Egyptian ceasefire policy, which was really put together by General al-Sisi. And if the Gaza-Israeli conflict is to remain settled, it's going to be through the auspices of General al-Sisi, now the president of Egypt, rather than through the Obama administration in Washington. And it's probably not an exaggeration to say that at this moment, the Israelis trust President al-Sisi far more than they trust President Obama. Israel is the most technologically advanced country in the Middle East. And next to the United States, it might be, and probably is, the most technologically advanced country in the world. But absolutely, it's our greatest ally in the Middle East. So the bottom line of all this is here, Iran. The sanctions hit them hard, and therefore they needed to create a different image. So you get Rouhani, a nice face, looks good. But never forget, he doesn't have the votes. The only vote in Iran belongs to Ayatollah. Iraq, there is no Iraq. And the current arrangements will soon break up if it hasn't already broken up. And there's no trust between Shia and Sunni. And whoever has the power goes after the other one. It's been that way for 1,400 years, and it ain't going to change, not in our lifetime. Syria. Iran will do whatever it has to do to maintain control of Syria. One of the reasons, because it's a direct line of communications into Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria is now in a failed state. And I think that after Syria, the target's going to be Jordan, because Jordan's the door to the Gulf states, and it's also a kingdom, and they haven't really overthrown a kingdom yet. Lebanon, the fractional divisions of Lebanon have been widened because of the war in Syria, and if that war ever ends, Hezbollah will return, and they'll be far, far stronger. Israel, I think we got to give Netanyahu our full support, which we are not doing right now. And we need to assist him in a strike against Iranian nuclear facilities if that becomes necessary. And you got to remember that Israel has been the pivotal of human history for 4 millennia. The pivotal of human history for 4 millennia. What do we need to do? One, we need to develop energy independence ASAP. Just think, if 6 years ago we had allowed the pipeline to come in, we had allowed fracking, right now you could take and tell Putin to shove it, because you could say, tell the European countries, we'll provide you all. Screw that guy, get him out of there. We need to support Israel, the only nation in the Middle East that's aligned with our Western goals and values. We need to prevent a nuclear Iran. We need to increase our efforts to stop the jihadists throughout the world. And we need to give full support to the Kurds in northern Iraq. Actually, what we need to do, we need to inform the Middle East countries that we will ensure the survival of Kurdish Iraq. However, Arab Iraq is their problem. We lost nearly 5,000 Americans there, spent billions and billions of dollars there. So we should say, okay, you Iranians, Turks, Saudis, and Emirates, you provide the ground force. You defeat ISIS. We'll ensure the safety and survival of the Kurds. 6, you could never, as you all know, never, never, ever tell the enemy what you're not going to do. Leave all the options on the table and make him guess what you are or are not going to do. And finally, if it's possible, we need to start carrying the big stick again. One thing to think about as our Army draws smaller and they're going to take us down to 1940 levels, that we got 239 years of history. And that 239 years, we've been at war 169 of those years. So 2/3 of the time, we're fighting somebody. So if you look at the world today, the Middle East, Russia, North Korea, China, Africa, to reduce the ground force is imbecilic. I mean, it just can't happen. That kind of covers what I wanted to talk to you about, but I want to read you a prayer because I like it. And I think it's pretty good, so I'm going to read it to you. It's called I Asked For. I got this from Dutch Schaffner, by the way. It said, I asked for strength. God gave me difficulties to make me strong. I asked for wisdom. God gave me problems to solve. I asked for prosperity, and God gave me a brain and brawn so I could work. I asked for courage. God gave me dangers to overcome. I asked for love, and God gave me troubled people that I could help. I asked for favors. God gave me opportunities. I didn't get anything that I asked for, but I got everything I needed. All my prayers have been answered. Hey, God bless you. Thank you for having me here.